Hello, welcome to Brain Development and Nurturing Young Children's Growing Minds. I'm Victoria Tennant, and I'll be your instructor tonight and for our next session next week as well. I'd like to start by sharing with you just a little bit about my background, and then we'll take a look at the agenda and we'll talk about calling times for attendance. I started as an early childhood teacher. I taught kindergarten and first grade, and as I was teaching, I was also teaching teachers in an in-service program called Math Their Way. And I was looking for good classes to take that I could weave into not only my teaching of young children, but also working with educators. And so in 1980, I came across a class called the Brain-Mind Revolution. It was a week-long class. People from all over the world were there to present how their research on the brain tied into working with children. And it started a lifelong passion of mine. I was so excited after the week was over. I went back to my kindergarten classroom and shared everything I learned with my kindergarten children, who thought it was more fascinating than dinosaurs. And I shared the information with parents during parent-teacher conferences. I wove the information into the teacher in-services I was doing. And I became addicted to finding out as much as I could about the brain. And there wasn't much out for the layperson like myself at that time. So I had to go all over the United States to find classes that were applicable. In 1983, I had enough information to start my first 3-credit class through Seattle Pacific University. It was 30 hours. It was for teachers. And it was about applying brain research to teaching and learning. That then led into all kinds of interesting classes and experiences that have been over a 20-year journey of really looking into, in depth, how the information on the brain can help us as parents, as teachers, as people that work with children, enrich their lives. I am an independent consultant now, and I work with people all over the United States. I have recently been working with an organization called CHEF, which is a Comprehensive Health Education Foundation, and many of the overheads that you'll see tonight come from a program that I co-authored with CHEF called Healthy Beginnings, Nurturing Young Children's Growing Minds. I've been doing foster parent trainings for the past 3 years, and I'm really excited to share this information to all of you as foster parents, because what my hope is that as you hear the impact that experiences have on the developing brain, that you will feel very validated in the work that you're doing with the children that you're taking into your home, and also all children that you come in contact with. The other thing that I would like you to feel is inspired and hopeful about the ability that we have to help transform and heal children's lives if they have been affected by abuse or neglect. And hopefully, as we go through the next 2 evenings together, you will also have some keys to unlocking the children's unlimited potential that they have. So if you have your packet in front of you, I hope everybody has handouts at your sites. We're going to look at the agenda, and then that will take us right into our call-in times for the sites that are out there. So in your packet, on the very first page after the cover sheet, you'll see an agenda. Our time is from 6 to 9. We are going to start with an introduction about the brain, and then we're going to be focusing on brain development so that we have a foundation for the final topic that we're going to be working with tonight, nurturing children's growing minds. Notice that under nurturing children's growing minds, you see moving, sensing, and exploring, seeing, remembering, and imagining, listening, talking, and understanding. The emotional piece, emotional development, is going to be focused on in depth next week. We're going to have a time in between the brain development and nurturing children's young or growing minds to allow you at your sites to share some of your connections that you're making as you're experiencing this information, and also to jot down any comments and questions that you'd have for a call-in session that we'll be doing at the end of our evening, which is from 8:30 to 8:55. Our break tonight will be from 7:20 to 7:30, and we'll also be doing quite a bit of moving at the end of our evening, so that I think you'll find that our time will be informative, enjoyable, and energizing. For our call-in, the first group to call in is Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Anacortes. And then at 6:15, Chehalis, Clarkston, Cursic, the Kalispel tribe. 6:30, Forks, Goldendale, and Kelso. 6:45, Long Beach, Linwood and Edmonds, Nespelem, Colville tribe. 7:15, Newport, Olympia, Omak. 7:30, Pasco, Port Angeles, Port Hadlock. 7:45, Port Orchard, Bremerton, Puyallup, Tacoma. And 8:15, Walla Walla, Welpinit, Spokane tribe, and Yakima. So hello, all of you, in the variety of sites that we have out there tonight. In your packet, on page 2, you have the very beginning of the research and information that we're going to be talking about, and you have very thorough notes. So some of you that are distracted by taking notes, you can relax and know this is in your packet, and I'll continue as we go through the evening to kind of keep you on track of where we are in the packet, and you'll also see that on overheads. And if you are a note taker as well, then you're certainly welcome to take notes on the pages that are relevant to the information that you're thinking about. We're going to start, though, with more of a right brain activity, a more concrete, hands-on activity. And I'm going to hold up a walnut. And I'd like you to think about how this walnut might be like a brain. How is this walnut like a brain? And just share with someone sitting next to you an idea that you have. Can be any idea at all. And then come back to focus together. This little walnut has a similarity to the brain in that it has two halves, and some of you may be thinking about the two sides, and we're going to talk about this later on this evening, the left and the right brain in terms of language, and we'll talk about how distinct the two halves are. And if you opened this walnut, you'd see a little connector inside, a little bridge that connects the two halves of the walnut, and that's very much like a very important connector in the brain, which acts as a bridge. And we'll talk about how important it is to develop that bridge through movement. It's wrinkled, and there's a real important reason for how wrinkly or convoluted the brain is, and we're going to be discussing that next time when we talk about this higher level thinking part of the brain, the cortex. And the size, of course, would not be the size of our own brains, hopefully. This is about the size of a cat's brain. So if you think about, in your imagination, holding an adult human brain, you're holding that in your hands. The size is about the size of a cantaloupe. It weighs between 3 and 3.5 pounds, which is actually pretty heavy. If you go to the supermarket and you pick up a cabbage that weighs about 3 pounds, it always surprises me at how heavy that is. In your imagination, make it a pinkish color. It's kind of the color of the inside of a puppy's ear. So when you think of a brain being gray, that's actually after a brain has been dead for a while. Now, feel the consistency in your imagination and imagine that it feels like squishy Jell-O. So you have in your hands this rather unappealing 3 to 3.5 pounds lump of matter, which is the human brain. But this is the best organized, the most functional, the most awesome 3 pounds of matter in the known universe. I'm going to put a transparency up. This is from a magazine called Scientific American, and the title of this particular issue was Mysteries of the Mind. How we think, how we behave, and what we feel. The brain is very complex, and we're going to talk tonight about the structures and functions, and I'm going to give you some definitions. And the important thing, I think, for us to keep in mind is that it's just a start. That as we learn about the brain, we're really in the scientific community at the very beginning of this research. There's so much that's not understood and that's not known. In the last 5 years, scientists have learned more about the brain than in the past 100 years. So the 90s truly have been the decade of the brain. And much of how they have discovered about the brain's functions comes from very sophisticated imaging techniques. And you see on the screen right now a picture of a PET scan. And this PET scan is something that some of you may have had done. It looks at what areas of the brain are burning energy. So it's looking at functional areas of the brain. The real hot colors that you see are the colors that are being activated at this particular moment in time. So this person has received a little trace of radioactive dye that traces glucose or sugar, because the brain burns sugar as energy. So PET scans are one of the imaging devices that are teaching us about the brain and its functions. This is another PET scan that you'll see in a moment, just a different cross-section. And this imaging technology, the PET scan, has actually been around for quite some time, but it's getting more sophisticated. And then if you take a look at your packet on page 2, you'll see in the little box there that there are other imaging technologies that measure not the function, but measure the structure of the brain. So maybe some of you have had an MRI or a CAT scan, and this is like a map of the brain. What's exciting is now scientists are able to take real-time movies of the brain in action. Imaging devices that allow us to measure both structure and function, not just at one moment in time, because this particular picture that you see here, like all the PET scans that we have and all the MRIs that we have, is just from one particular moment in time. So if you look at your little box on page 2, you'll see an fMRI plus MEG, and I'll let you read the long version of that. And this is a combination that allows scientists to really look at the brain as it's processing information, and this has been a huge breakthrough. I'm going to read you an excerpt from a high school in Utah. This was published in the Deseret newspaper in 1998. And this is an example of how this new technology is beginning to impact not just the way that they diagnose difficulties with the brain or problems, but also taking a look at some of the questions that we as parents and teachers ask. How do children learn? What's going on in the brain when something isn't working right for them? So this high school, Granger High School in Utah, has hooked up with the Department of Radiology at the University of Utah, and is using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, to take movies of how students' brains are working as they are learning. The machine looks like an old-fashioned hairdryer. It works by measuring magnetic waves outside of the head. At the time of this publication, there were only 5 nationwide, and there are many more now, but they're still very expensive and very difficult to use, so it's not something that you and I can just go sign up for. But what they're finding is that they're able to see, as these children are solving a math problem, for example, how they learn best. Are they visualizing? Then the visual areas of the brain will be activated. Are they talking to themselves as they're solving the problem? Then the auditory areas or the hearing areas of the brain will be activated. Do they need hands-on experiences? Are they using their fingers and are they kind of sensing it in their body? Then the kinesthetic areas will be activated. This is just the start. So imagine the possibilities that we have in the next 10 years as science becomes more sophisticated in their ability to really look inside the brain. We're going to be starting out now with a little bit of information about the basic building blocks of the brain. These are called neurons, and they're brain cells that regulate all of our thinking. I'm going to show you a closer version of this picture, and then I'll come back to the text. And if you turn in your packet to page 3, you'll see this information. So these are cells called neurons, and we're going to go through this in several ways. I'm going to be talking about this right now using the overhead. Then we're going to be looking at a very simple diagram that's color-coded, and then we're going to do it with our in some hands-on ways. So if you don't quite understand the first time around, this will flow for you, I'm sure, as we begin to repeat this information. So these are cells of the brain that are regulating all of our thinking. So right now, as you're looking at the screen and as you're hearing my words and you're thinking about the information, these cells in your brain called neurons are busy transmitting signals that are allowing you to take information in through your senses, allowing you to make connections in your mind. And they transmit those signals through these little telegraph-like wires called axons and dendrites. And we're going to be learning about axons and dendrites because they really are the pathways in the brain that allows the brain to learn, to take information in, to make sense of the world. Through these little pathways, we have information running through electrically, and we'll see how that works in just a moment, and chemically. These connections, these connectors, are called synapses. And another word for that, which I like a little bit better, is pathway, because they really do allow pathways for the information to move through. So each pathway allows us to process information. And in an average brain, we have approximately, as an adult, 100+ billion neurons. And the connectors between those neurons, they estimate, are approximately 500 trillion. Now that's a really big number, and it's pretty hard to get a sense of how big that number is. And I love doing this because I think it helps us realize how awesome each of our own brains are. So let's think about 1 trillion. If you were going to count to 1 trillion, counting one number per second, and we're going to start right now, just think about how long it would take you to get to 1 trillion. And you might want to share with the person sitting next to you, just a guesstimate, make it a really wild guess. How long will it take to get to 1 trillion? If you guessed a big number, you were on the right track. But I wonder if your number was as large as this. 32,000 years to count to 1 trillion. And the average brain has 500 trillion of these connectors. Very awesome. Scientists have estimated that the minimum number of possible thought patterns in the adult human brain is the numeral 1 followed by 6.5 miles of typed zeros. So right now, your own brain, regardless of how tired you are, how much coffee you had today, how alert you feel, your brain is processing information with an efficiency that's far beyond the world's fastest supercomputer. But the computer analogy doesn't go very far with the brain, because unlike a computer, instead of wearing out through use, your brain can actually grow and get better, and that's something we'll be focusing on in the next 2 sessions. Your own brain is physically learning or physically changing as you learn today. So what we're going to do now is take a look at another diagram that is very simplified. If you turn in your packets to page 4, you'll see a picture of neurons, and I'll put this up on the screen in just a moment. And we're going to be looking at the parts of those neurons. And on page 5 is the description of the parts that I'm going to be explaining. So you have both of those in your packet. So what we're going to look at now is a real simplified version of a neuron, and we'll talk about the parts. And the reason this is going to be important for us is that when we begin to look at how experiences impact the brain, we need this as a foundation. And the technical terms, which I'm going to be giving you some term names, aren't really as important as just kind of getting the basic idea of how this works. So we have a neuron here with a cell body, and in the cell body is a little genetic map. A little bit of DNA is there that is manufacturing chemicals that are going to be used in this process, in this message transmission process. And also in the cell body, nutrients are manufactured to keep the cell healthy. And then we have these little branch-like structures coming off of the cell body, and these are called dendrites. Dendrites are receivers for incoming electrical messages. So little electrical impulses actually travel through this dendrite, this branch-like dendrite, to the cell body. And there is a little electrical charge that is coming from our own brains right now, enough to run a flashlight. So let's say that your eyes right now are taking this information in, and so this neuron, let's pretend, is a vision neuron. So it's taking the electrical impulses that your eyes are sending to the cell body, and then it's going to send it out to another neuron until it gets to its destination. And when it sends it out through this structure called an axon. And an axon is a sender. So dendrites receive and axons send. And just look at that for a moment and think to yourself how the axon looks different than these little branch-like dendrites. There are some similarities, but there are some distinct differences. One of the differences is that we can have hundreds of thousands of dendrites, but only one axon. And those axons that the brain has can actually be very long. Some of them are up to 3.5 feet in length. Those start from the motor sensory band in your brain, and they go all the way down your spinal cord. The other thing that's different about the axon are these little sausage-like structures. And we're going to be talking about those next time we meet, because that is an insulation that develops over time, and it has a lot to do with readiness levels, when children are able to move from crawling to walking, for example. So we have information coming in electrically through a dendrite to the cell body, out an axon, and once this electrical impulse gets to the end of an axon, these are called terminals, and the axon branch actually branches out so that it allows it to communicate with more than one receiving neuron. When it gets to the end, there's a little tiny space between it and the receiving neuron that's getting ready to take this message in. And this space is called the synaptic gap. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard that term before. And at the synaptic gap, there's a chemical signal that basically gives the message of on or off to this receiving neuron. It's very complex, but we're going to keep that part really simple. And then once this neuron is turned on, if that's the case, then it's going to send this message just the same way that neuron number 1 did. Now, if that's making your head swim and it's difficult to conceptualize, we have 2 volunteers that are going to help us get this in a more concrete way. Okay, so we have neuron number 1 and neuron number 2. You guys are great. Okay, so what we're going to show is how an electrical impulse comes in through neuron number 1, and I'm using a flashlight to show that electricity, and neuron number 1's dendrite is starting to vibrate a little bit. It has a certain frequency when it's activated, and it's coming in through a little bead-like structure you see here. This is called a spine or a receptor site. So this impulse can actually be activated any place on the dendrite's receptor site. So we'll say it comes in through here. It travels through the dendrite. So if this is a vision neuron, it would be bringing in visual images. And it goes to the cell body. And then it's going to be sent back out, you're doing a great job, neuron number 1, through the axon. And you can really see, I hope, the sausage-like insulation that's on this axon. And once the electrical impulse gets to the end, there's another little bead-like structure on the end here. This is called a bouton. And in the bouton are chemicals that are stored that are involved in this synaptic gap process. So once the electrical impulse gets to the end, it actually shuts off. It's like pulling a cord out of an electrical socket. So the electricity stops, and we have neuron number 2 getting ready to receive. It knows that a message is coming its way, and it's starting to vibrate. And so let's say this chemical message does say on. It wants to turn neuron number 2 back on. We're keeping that real simple. So here comes the electrical impulses again, and it travels down the dendrite to a cell body. Good job, neuron number 2. And then it's going to go to another neuron. And so it's going to be sent through an axon, and that's vibrating as well. Gets to the end where that little bouton is, and it shuts off for a moment, and the chemical process happens, and then there's a decision that's made whether or not to turn another receiving neuron on or off until it gets to its decision. Now, how these little electrical impulses actually are transmitted in a way that leads to thoughts, and how the neurons know when it's time to stop is a great mystery. No one really knows that. So we're going to now bring some more neurons on stage, and this is something that you're all going to do at your sites. So you're going to get a chance in a moment. Right now we'd like you just to watch, to get up and feel this in your body, because that's going to be the best way that you will learn this, is to internalize it. So we have these lovely volunteers who are all neurons, and this is what you will be doing as well when we give you the signal. And I'm going to have just a moment to set this group up. And so all of you, if you would just kind of scatter randomly and face the same direction you're facing now, so face forward. And I'm going to bring you over here, Linda. And I'm going to bring you over here. Okay. And I'm going to bring you right here. All right, perfect. Okay, good job. And so now what we're going to do is show how a message is transmitted to multiple neurons so that it forms a pathway. And so with my volunteers, if you receive a message, and I'll show you how this is going to work in a moment, then you're going to receive it through your dendrite, and you're going to send it out through your axon to another neuron that's close by, and I'll explain that in a moment. But I'd like you to keep your arms up, because we want to show, once you've been zapped, you'll keep your arms up so we can show a pathway. So let me set this up for the audience first, and then I'll walk you through this demonstration. Let's say that we here, and I'm going to be part of this as well, are neurons in the brain of a little child who is just learning how to track with their eyes a ball that's rolling across the carpet. So there's a lot of complex movement that's going on with that, and eye-hand coordination. But we're going to just take a look at one tiny pathway, one visual pathway that would be in the brain of this little baby. So they're just, for the very first time, and that's going to be real important, you'll see why that is in just a moment, very first time able to follow with their eyes and their hand as that ball rolls across the floor. So what we see here in our neurons is a group of vision neurons. So they're part of the vision pathway. And I'm going to have, in a moment, the message start. And so we'll do it just like we did before. And when it gets to you, would you pass it on to me? And so I'm going to receive it, and then I'm going to send it on to somebody else. And we're going to keep our arms up. And what we're going to do is try to get, is it Bob?
Yeah.
Try to get to Bob. Okay? And we want to have a pathway that gets to Bob because he's our destination. Now, notice that Linda was left out, and that was on purpose. And Linda has a very important role to play in just a moment. Okay? So I'm just going to go zap. That's our signal for this process to start. Okay? Here we go. Zap. And we're not actually touching. Okay, now you decide where you're going to go. We want to get to Bob. That's our destination. Oh, great job. And we have a pathway. Okay, now relax. Now that was a little slow, neurons. And actually that's great. We wanted it to be slow. And we wanted it, with a small group like this, there isn't a whole lot of confusion. But the reason we want that, and we want the slowness, and when you do it in your sites, the bigger the group you have and the more confused you get, actually the better. Because this is the first time that little child has actually made that connection between following that ball with their eyes and their hands. So the brain is having to create its own pathways. And the very first time through, there is confusion, it's slow, there are mistakes. And so if the child does that again, and that ball rolls by again, and they track with their eyes and their hands, the brain has a tendency to follow those same pathways. So we're going to do this again exactly the same way we did it before and see if we can be faster. Okay? So here we go. Zap. All right, that was much faster. Now relax. So the brain would begin to have this pathway down, and it would become more efficient. The transmission of information would become smoother. Now we're going to do it one more time, and we're going to see if we can even beat our last record. And Linda, then I'm going to give you a role to play after we've got our pathway in place. So zap. Okay, good. Almost automatic. And so as a behavior is repeated over and over and over again, the brain reflects that in strengthened pathways between neurons that are involved with that particular process. Now, our poor neuron here that didn't have, let me stand over here so you can see, that didn't have a role to play, if this was actually in the brain, after a certain period of time, the neurons that aren't activated will actually die. They will be pruned away. So Linda, I'm going to have you just go off the set because we've lost one of our neurons. This is called pruning. And we're going to be talking about pruning and really looking at the positive part of pruning, because pruning can be a good thing, and when pruning is not a good thing. So what I'd like you to do in your sites now is to stand up in a moment, as soon as I finish giving you some directions here. Stand up so that you're all neurons, and see if you can pass a message from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, keeping those pathways up. And if you have enough people, you may have a couple people that will not be part of your pathway and that will actually be pruned away after the third time. So I'm going to have you just do this little demonstration over and over 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And then if you have neurons that can be pruned away, that's fine. If you don't have enough people, then you don't need to do that part. But just get a feel for this in your bodies. Okay, so go ahead and stand up, and you can start the demonstration, and then we'll come back up on the screen, and I'll let you know when it's time to refocus. And thank you very much for your participation, and especially our neurons in the costumes. You did great. Thanks, you guys. Okay, if you can come back now and sit back down. And I hope you had a chance to feel what that was like. And I bet you won't forget about dendrites and axons and pathways after seeing our neuron costumes. Our two volunteers that were in the neuron costumes certainly won't forget, because novelty is one of the things that really creates pathways, novelty and emotion. And so we have repetition and an emotional charge that helps these pathways form. So what we're going to do now is look at this as a review of what we just talked about using your handout, and I'm going to be putting information up on the screen as well so that we can really get this into our left brains now, because that was a very right brain demonstration that we just experienced. If you turn to page 6 in your packet, you'll see in the little box the same text that we have up here on the screen. So neurons tend to reconnect along the same pathway each time the brain responds to a similar stimulus. So those connections, or synapses, grow in a brain when experiences are repeated over and over. That's why children, young children, love to hear the same stories over and over and over again until it just about drives you crazy. Or the same songs, or they drop their spoon off their high chair to be picked up over and over and over again. The brain is actually building pathways through repetition. The other way that pathways are built is through an experience that triggers a strong emotional reaction. So it might be just, a sense of surprise, or fear, or anger, or delight. Anything that triggers a real strong emotional reaction actually causes those chemicals that were released at the synaptic gap to set a pathway, so it doesn't need the repetition that it normally would. That's why you want to really have children hooked into what it is that they're learning on an emotional level, interested, questioning, involved, because it helps set those pathways. I'm sure you can think of times in your life when you've had a strong emotional reaction to something and you remember it as clearly as it just happened. The earthquake that just happened with us in Olympia, the bigger one, is certainly going to be a day that I will remember. I don't have to rehearse that over and over and over again. When you have a combination of repetition and emotion, high involvement, then you really have a very strong set for helping lay those pathways down, which ties directly into learning. So something that I find to be so fascinating still, each time I talk about this, is the idea that experience literally sculpts the brain. So right now, as you're learning this information, the more involved you are, and the more I can present this to you in different ways, going through similar information but in different ways, the more your brain is actually going to be changing. If you are familiar with this information, if you have been reading up on brain research, then you may be adding into that those foundational pathways that have been laid down. So everybody is changing in a different way, because we're all unique. Another thing that happens as neurons are being used, as they're being activated, is that the neuron itself grows and changes. So we have pathways that form, and that's called branching. And we also have a single neuron growing new branches. So it becomes fluffier in a way. And we have more of those little receptor sites, more of those bead-like structures that you saw on our neuron model, our dendrite model, so that it can take in more information. And the axons have more branches, more terminal sites, so it can send more information. So the more a neuron is used, the more efficiently it is able to process information. When we had Linda sit down because she had been pruned, she was demonstrating what happens with unused neurons and connections. So they actually will wither away. They'll lose their dendrites, and they will eventually die if they've lost too many dendrites. So this is called pruning. And let's talk about the positive part of pruning first. When you prune a beautiful tree, what you're doing is creating a tree that's actually healthier. So you prune away the dead or the sicker branches, you shape it so that it looks more aesthetic, and you just improve the quality of the tree if you know what you're doing. So the brain actually is pruning itself all the time. It's sculpting away all of the neurons that are not used. And if you think about all the pathways that would form each time the child has an experience, we would have an incredible jumble of pathways. So the brain is always cleaning house, so to speak. So that's an example of pruning that is in the best interests of the brain and helps us actually think better. There's a period of pruning, in a positive sense, that begins around age 10. And I'm sure some of you are kind of laughing as you think about children going into puberty. And this period lasts for several years. The brain prunes itself from day one. But this is a cycle of pruning where there's a lot of sculpting going on. And so thinking about a 10-year-old, what's going to be pruned away are those pathways that are not used. And we're going to talk a little bit later on today about the impact of specific kinds of experiences. And one of the things we'll talk about is screen time. So if you have children in those puberty years spending a lot of time watching TV, playing video games, then their pathways that are involved in those types of stimulation are going to be strengthened, but the other pathways that activate a broader part of the brain when they play sports or create art or are performing music are not going to be as activated, and they could lose some of those. So pruning can be a really good thing, and it can also be a bad thing and decrease our ability to think, depending on what is pruned. And that depends on what is used. So what we're really talking about when we talk about pathways is not just something that's happening physiologically in the brain, but we're talking about the foundation for learning. So these pathways are truly the keys to learning and remembering. And for young children, most of the pathways that are laid down as a result of information that they're taking in through their senses. So what they see, what they hear, what they feel, how their body moves. And that's why we're going to be spending time later on this evening talking about the kinds of experiences that help develop their senses, because it is what lays the foundation down for learning, and it will impact that child's success throughout life. So where we are in your packet now is on page 7 at the top part of the box. And I'd like to share with you a little bit of information about learning stages. And that takes you to the bottom of page 7. So pathways equal foundations for learning. And babies are born learning. If you look at the bottom of your box there, you'll see some statistics. And it says birth, 50 trillion connections. Most of these connections, most of these pathways are the result of direct experiences. So think about what could be going on in the womb that would actually be laying those pathways down, because the baby is learning in the womb. So just think back to what you know about babies in the womb and think about the kinds of experiences they would be having. And you might want to share a thought. What would be one way a baby in the womb would be learning with somebody sitting next to you, or you can just think about it. Those of you that have been pregnant know how much movement goes on in the womb. So babies are learning through movement. And those pathways are actually wiring up. The movement is helping them explore their world already. Babies are hearing. We're going to be talking about language later on tonight. And they're hearing language that's being spoken around them. So their hearing pathways, their auditory pathways are already being hooked up. So we have babies coming into the world with a set of connections. When a child is born, an infant's brain, and let's define that as birth to 12 months, is just forming these pathways at an incredible rate, 3 billion a second. It's hard to really look at a young child without, now, for me, without thinking about what is going on in their brain, that their brain is just exploding with pathways. And if you look down at the statistics, you'll see 3 years, by the 3rd year, that child has now 1,000 trillion pathways. And their brain weight has actually tripled. So it's literally impacting how much the brain weighs. Now that stops at about 3 in terms of physically impacting the weight of the brain. There's a real subtle weight gain after that. So we can't get on the scale as adults and say we've gained a pound and it's, oh, I must have really been using my brain a lot now. It doesn't quite work that way. But in those beginning years, that birth to 3, the brain is physically growing, and it's growing because of the experiences the child has. Then if you just look at your box, you'll see that for the rest of the first decade, children's brains have twice as many connections as adults' brains do before the pruning happens. So that first decade, birth to 10, is truly they're the wonder years of learning, when their brain is just taking it all in like a sponge. Notice that down at the adult age, we have 500 trillion connections. So this is the result of pruning. And let's say this is an adult that's using their brain in a healthy way, so the pruning is actually very healthy. Here's some interesting pictures that help us see this process in a little different way, a little more visual way. These are slides of neurons, and I like these because you can really tell that the neurons have this kind of root-like, branch-like appearance. So this first column is at birth, and you can see some connections, but look at 6 years old. Getting very thick, a thick forest of pathways and branches. And then 14, and this again would be in a healthy brain, you have pruning that has gone on. So some of those pathways have been pruned away to help the brain become more efficient, so you don't have such a jumble. This is another illustration. This is a PET scan, and unfortunately I don't have this one in color, so the dark areas you see are actually the areas that are being activated. And the scan is a 5-day-old with not a lot of activation going on yet, a 2-month-old, and then look at the 1-year-old and the 28-year-old. So these are the two I'd like you to really focus on. And notice that the 1-year-old's brain really does look twice as active as that 28-year-old's brain. So young children, the belief that we used to have that young children really aren't learning much until they get to be school-aged is absolutely the opposite of what is really true. If you go now in your packet to page 8, this research about how the brain responds to learning, which started in 1963, that was a real breakthrough year, is changing the way that scientists look at intelligence and look at that old controversy between nature or nurture. Are we born with a limit? Are we born with a lid on how smart we can become? Or is it limitless? And with the information on the role that experiences play, it certainly helps us understand that there doesn't need to be a limit based on the right kinds of experiences. But we also have the genetic component, and we looked at the neurons and we saw the cell body and how the cell body has a little bit of that genetic map, the DNA, encoded within it. Those two areas, both what we're born with, what we've inherited genetically, and what we experience, are like a dance. And this dance becomes how intelligent we are. So it's not an either-or. It is a beautiful dance between the two, between what we've inherited and what we experience. Thinking about it metaphorically, genes are the blueprint and experiences are the carpenter that create the unique human being. On page 10 in your packet, you see a nice fluffy neuron and then a neuron that has lost many of its dendrite branches through lack of use. And this summarizes really what we've been talking about the importance of the environment, the importance of experiences. That active involvement in a stimulating, challenging, and loving environment causes the brain to grow and flourish. And the other converse side of that is that passive involvement, isolation, and an impoverished environment diminishes the brain. You have your diagram on page 9, I'm sorry, and then you have follow-up information on page 10. So I like to think about experiences in terms of brain food, and you have some information about that on page 10. That we want children to come into the world with a rich banquet of experiences that truly cause their brains, their minds, their bodies, their spirits to grow and to flourish. That's the ideal. We want them to experience things that are meaningful. We want them to feel loved and nurtured because that impacts brain growth as well, and there's been a lot of really interesting studies about that, and we're going to talk about that more when we get together next time. And they aren't the kinds of experiences that require expensive toys, fancy outings and trips, special training. It's really the drip, drip, drip of daily experiences, the little interactions that you have with a child, having them help you do the laundry, they're going to the grocery store with you, talking with the child, reading to the child, telling stories, many of the things which we're going to be talking about later. Those are the kinds of daily experiences that really make for an enriched environment of children. Unfortunately, and I'm sure you're thinking about this right now, many of the foster children that you get into your homes have had brains that may be starving for the right kinds of experiences or the right kinds of emotional input. And so their brain is different than the brain of a child that would be raised in this enriched environment. They don't have the pathways in place that they could. They don't have the healthy neurons that could be receiving information in a way that they could. So an impoverished environment actually diminishes the brain. And there's a quote on page 10 that I'm going to read to you. It's kind of toward the bottom of the page. That says, "It doesn't take the orphanage scene from David Copperfield to qualify as an impoverished environment. All it takes is a toddler sitting alone and passive for hours in front of a television set, dreaming eyes of wonder glazed over, imagination shelved, exploratory energy on hold. Then throw in a bowl of potato chips and a soda." Now, you can overdo it as well, and it's always about balance, isn't it? Because overstimulation, overstructure, too much, can actually cause the brain to shut down. It's like when we get overstimulated, overstructured, overwhelmed. Maybe there are certain times in your life when you've got a lot going on, and even if it's positive, there's a point where we just don't want any more stimulation, and we shut down. So next week we're going to talk about stress in the brain, and overstimulation is something that does create stress. And we'll see that what happens when we're experiencing stress is that it causes the higher brain structures to just turn off and delegate what's going on to more of the survival brain. So we want to have a balance in helping children experience an enriched environment and just letting them be, letting them have their down times. And they let us know, don't they? Their frustration and their crankiness level let us know about those down times. On page 11, you see a box that has the title Windows of Opportunity. So as children are experiencing different things in their environment, their brains have optimal times for when it's going to respond to that, when they're going to grow. So there are certain times when the brain becomes much more active in response to what the senses absorb, growing and learning faster than any other time in life. So children really need not only experiences, but they need the right experiences at the right times for their brains to develop fully. We're going to be looking at some of those windows of opportunity in our next topic, and we'll continue with those emotional windows next week. But before we do that, I think something that many of you are already thinking about is, well, is it too late then with these children that we're getting that haven't had the experiences they need and they've already had the result of some pruning, their brains don't have those nice healthy pathways again? Have we missed the opportunities that these children need? And this is where I really am inspired by the research, and I want you to really take this in, because the brain is really remarkable in its ability to heal and to regenerate pathways. So we talked about the fact that the brain has over 100 billion neurons and trillions of pathways. And when the brain prunes away unused pathways, it's important for us to remember that it still has billions of neurons that haven't been activated. In fact, that's one speculation why we have such a huge percentage and why we actually use about 2% of the potential of the brain to process information, because we always have this rich store of neurons that are really waiting to be activated that can help fill in the missing gaps. So on page 12, you see a box that I think is a real key point to keep in mind as we go through our windows of opportunity later on tonight. And that is that windows of opportunity never totally close. Now, some of those windows are more unforgiving than others, and we'll be talking about that in a bit. But for most functions, it's never too late to form new connections. The human brain is truly remarkable in its ability to heal. I'm going to show you this example. I'll put a close-up of this. This is a rather dramatic example. It's certainly not the norm, but I think for me that this really brings the point home. This is the brain, a PET scan. Again, the dark areas are the areas that are being activated, of a little boy who had severe epilepsy on one side of his brain, and it was so severe that it was life-threatening. And so for a very radical approach, because it was really all they could do, they needed to remove the half of the brain that this child was having epileptic seizures in. So this is before surgery, 3 years, 11 months. And then here's a PET scan 3 months after the surgery. So now this little boy is 4 years, 3 months. And notice there's nothing going on there because that part of the brain is gone. It's missing. It's been removed. But here's the picture that I want you to keep in your mind forever. This is 2 years after the surgery, 6 years, 1 month. And notice what's happening to this side. The brain is starting to fill in, literally, the missing mass. And it's doing that in response to experiences. So the neurons on this side are taking over the missing functions from the neurons on this side and physically actually filling in, creating new pathways. And if we looked at another slide or another PET scan of this child at 8 years old, for example, my hunch is that we'd see even more of that mass filled in. So the brain is truly remarkable in its ability to heal. And the new brain research that's coming up now is emphasizing this fact more than ever. And so we're going to be talking, once we get into windows of opportunity, about how you can help, and you do help, the foster children that you so graciously take into your homes fill in those missing pathways. So in summary, if you turn to page 13, what we've been talking about in terms of how the brain builds pathways and grows new dendrites is called plasticity, how easily changed the brain is. And it's most plastic early in life, especially in the first 3 years. The wonder years, birth to 10 or prenatal to 10, the brain is very plastic, but it's really at its peak in those first 3 years. A young brain changes its architecture minute by minute, reshaping itself to cope with experience. So if you bring foster children into your home that are very young, you really have an opportunity to impact how the brain is going to start changing its architecture based on the experiences that you give them. Now, the brain becomes less plastic, less easily changed with age, but I love this picture of an older grandma woman with a little baby, because her brain can continue to grow as well. It's truly never too late. We use it or we lose it. So you, as foster parents, have a really powerful opportunity to impact the development of your children by giving them the experiences that will help them fill in the missing pieces, fill in the missing pathways, rebuild the foundation, no matter what age. And you'll see on page 13, at the very top paragraph, that as the brain becomes less plastic, it continues to respond to experience. An older brain takes more time, however, more repetition, more persistence, and especially faith, a vision that change is possible for the child. There's a foster parent that I have had the privilege to meet, and I've had many privileges to meet foster parents because I admire you so much in the work you do. But she has a saying that's really stuck with me, and she says when she gets children, she says to herself, never say never. Never give up hope for children, regardless of how badly they are, quote, damaged from experiences or lack of experiences. But she also makes an important point that I think we need to keep in mind, and that is never say always, because we don't know with each individual what the keys are to opening up that child and to healing that child. And everyone is unique. Everyone has their timetable. Everyone has a big plan that they're following. So we keep a vision and we hope and we provide experiences for the child and we stay persistent. And we see what happens. There's some information which I'm not going to go into right now on page 13 that's very fun and is certainly important for me about the brain and aging and how as you get into your older years, they're finding some really, I think, exciting studies about how the brain continues to grow and expand into our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I'll just let you read through that on your own. Right now what I'd like to do is to have you skip over to page 15 and take a look at the bibliography here on 15. And there are some books that I would like to recommend because we're at the end of our brain development section. The first book, they're all good. The books I put on the list, there's so many out now. In the beginning, when I was first studying this information, there was very little, and now it's just the opposite. There's everywhere you turn, there's a new book out on brain development. And there's a lot focused on the early years, but the books I've chosen for you, these two actually go up through adolescence. This book is called Magic Trees of the Mind, and I know you can't see it very well on your screen there, but you can see it in your notes. How to Nurture Your Child's Intelligence, Creativity, and Healthy Emotions from Birth through Adolescence. If you are interested in the research and the applications, this would be a really good book for you to have, because it really summarizes the research that started in 1963 on brain growth. Another book that has the span of birth through adolescence is the last one in your bibliography. This is called Your Child's Growing Mind, A Guide to Learning and Brain Development from Birth to Adolescence by Jane Healy. And this is a book that has lots of practical strategies. It also has a lot about education. So if you're involved in the education of young children, this would be a book that I would highly recommend. Jane Healy is an educator, and she has synthesized this information very well for parents and teachers and other people that work with children. And then a very fun book, which is about the early years, but a lot of it can be, I use a lot of this information as an adult, so it can be adapted, is called Start Smart. And it has all kinds of really hands-on types of activities, lots of good pictures, lots of things to do that then tie into one particular area of brain research. So it's less research-oriented, although it does bring that in, more hands-on, and very fun. So if you're looking for a book that has a lot of fun and a lot of practical application, this might be the book that you would want to pick. You also have in your packet there some websites, and they're all good, and they all are about the developing brain, and they include lots of books and videos and information that you can access. So what we're going to do now is go back to page 14, because it has 3 questions on it that I would like you to be discussing in your sites. So this will not be a whole group discussion. We're not going to do our call-in yet until the end of our evening. But just in your sites, I'd like you to think about, and I'm sure you have been already, how this information that we've discussed so far relates to your role as a foster parent. And these questions are for your own guidance only. If you have other areas that you want to talk about that relate to this information, you're certainly welcome to do that. So the first question is, how does this information validate the impact that you have on a child's developing brain? And I hope that you're really understanding how much of an impact you truly have on these children. The next question is, what concerns do you have? Because often information like this brings up specific concerns. And what questions does it raise? That's kind of linked to the second question. In your discussion group, just share your thoughts about this, and then anything that you would like to jot down to ask during our call-in time, you can use this page to do so. And I'd like you to be thinking about, because when we go to the call-in, we're only going to have the time for one question coming from each site. And if we don't get through all our sites, then next time when we do call-ins, we'll start from the other end of our list so that everybody gets a turn. But you may want to be thinking about a good question that's coming up in your group that you'd like to ask, or a comment that you'd like to ask during the call-in. So you can do this in small groups if you have a big group of people at your site right now, or you may want to have just a whole group discussion, and I'll let the facilitators decide on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take from 7:15 to 7:25 for our discussion, and we're going to bump our break up 5. We're running a little bit behind, but we're still doing just great. We're going to be 5 minutes off on the break. So 7:15 to 7:25 for your site discussion, and then be sure you give yourselves a 10-minute break at the end. So 7:25 to 7:35 for the break. And if you get done with your discussions early, of course you can take a break earlier. So we're going to be coming back on the air at 7:35, and we'll move into Nurturing Children's Growing Minds, Windows of Opportunity. So have a good discussion, and I'll see you at 7:35. Thank you.